So we're going to talk about our visit in 4 stages. We're going to do some orientation and definitions, and we're going to go through some history for a few minutes. We're sort of representing those definitions. That'll be a quick review. This is not totally complete history, but it hopefully informs the things that we saw and we'll talk about. And then Jenny's going to come up and talk about a series of questions and reflections and things we can do going forward from there. I want to thank formally the Ramallah Friends School that we visited, the NERA, the Leonard Education Organization that he'll talk more about, particularly some folks that we had there, and Paul was at the Ramallah Friends School, and we really kind of found in them colleagues and allies to help us think about things. We do need to say when we begin that whatever we're saying here is our opinions. None of those organizations are to be represented by anything we say. And if we got it wrong, that's on us. That's not on any of those people we just mentioned or anyone else. This is us. A little orientation. This map shows you occupied Palestine. We'll talk more about those color patterns, but for now I want to show you Ramallah was right there, just north of Jerusalem. Tel Aviv also visited, is over on the coast there. Visited Jerusalem, which is right there in the center. But Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are the largest busiest cities in Israel, Palestine. We also spent a day down in Jericho. We got to Nablus, Tukar, which is a smaller community than those others. And then we spent 3 days in Gaza, visiting several cities in the year. So that was kind of our routes. All by driving and cabs and small vans. We didn't have a car. I wouldn't want to drive a car in any country in the Middle East. So that's not a comment about Israel, Palestine. That's just in general. My friend in Lebanon says we view traffic signs as suggestions. One of the things that sort of just to help you frame it, and we wrote a little piece, some of you may have seen about this, but we asked ourselves when we were coming back, what is it that we just experienced? And we feel most fundamentally we experienced is the sense of the ever-present occupation, which is really hard to get when you go visit for a week or 2 weeks. And I've done that a couple of times. I visited. But visiting for several months, this seeps in. This is a set of houses that were started for construction at Tukar, but they're there to see, and so the Israelis prevented their completion, but they stand partially done. Similar projects meant for Jewish residents, of course, are not only completed, but are being expanded. But the sense that the occupation is just everywhere, and it suffocates. It's just like a sort of a close, you're not dead from it, but you're exhausted from it. And so to that point, we have this little statement about this is kind of what we imagined our experiences summed up as. I don't know if you can all read, understand Palestinian life as being part of a conflict or struggle is to miss the depth and evil of the occupation as it has been practiced. As devised and as refined, the occupation is intended to discourage Palestinians from living in Palestine, to erase hope for independence, and to debilitate, humiliate, and degrade individuals at any and every time. And we will talk more about that. Okay, so these are the key terms we're going to go through: the Zionist project or Zionism, the UN partition, the Nakba, the occupation, the Oslo Accords, issues of settlements, the separation barrier, and finally we're going to define and talk a little bit about apartheid. This is the basic Palestinian timeline that we're going to touch on. We're not going to cover all of it, but the origin of this is that the Ottoman Turks took over this part of the Middle East in the middle of the last millennium. They basically ruled Palestine for about 500 years. So it was a part of the Turkish Empire. The Turkish Empire was much bigger. It included most of all of Iraq and Syria, down into Saudi Arabia, Sinai, not Egypt, but lots of parts of the Middle East. In the middle of that occupation by the Turks, in Europe, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and there was organized in Switzerland at the first Zionist Congress in in 1897, he sort of asked the question, if we can't live in Europe, where do we live? And a group of Zionists, who define themselves as, decided we should encourage people to go to Palestine. In 1917, this effort, which was now 20 years underway in very small steps, was proposed and eventually endorsed by the British foreign officer to a very wealthy Britishman, Lord Rothschild, who had been funding some of these immigrants. He said, "You're right, we'll talk about all of this." And the Britishman paid expansion, etc. So that's the timeline we're going to talk about. I don't want to go over each one now. We're going to come back. So start with this term Zionist. Zionist is a person who is a supporter of Zionism, a person who believes in the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what was Palestine and is now Israel. This is the Oxford definition. And Herzl's quote was, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state." This is a man we met in the train station in Tel Aviv, who helped us through the station because he's holding a rifle to his right shoulder. We were pretty sure he was. In the 1900s, around 1900, Jewish immigration began to Palestine. This is a picture on the left of Jaffa today, and on the right is a painting of Jaffa from 1947. It was even smaller than that in 1900. In Jaffa, when we walked around, we found this monument. This monument has three parts. I'm going to show you what they say. The top part says, "In everlasting memory of the restored of the Jewish Yeshiva." I don't know how to say that. In Jaffa, at the beginning, which basically, as I understand it, means a settlement or a community. So it says here at the beginning of the 19th century, but the history says this happened in 1909. So I thought that was the 20th century. But anyway, it's the 1909 date is when that first settlement came there. And the bottom one says, "Had it not been for this first Jewish settlement in Jaffa, we would not have lived to see the built-up city of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, they're now combined, and all the settlements around it," which I would say is exactly true. And this is a picture of Tel Aviv today from Jaffa, which is quite a big city. So there's a commemoration to the early history of this book. 1917, the Balfour Declaration. This is the Balfour Declaration. It was written in form of a letter from the Foreign Secretary to this very wealthy British person who was funding immigration to Israel after Palestine. And he said, "We view with favor the establishment of Palestine for Jewish people at home, and we use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." Here's what's really amazing. "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities." Non-Jewish communities were 95% of the population. Almost. Okay? Or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in the other country, because there were Jews all over the place. And the idea was they could stay if they wanted, and it doesn't hold up as an idea of time. So that was passed then. What happened was, right after the First World War, the powers that won the First World War divided up the Middle East. Britain was assigned Palestine as a mandatory power. The assignment of the mandatory overseers was to facilitate the development of independence and governance for these countries, areas, liberated from the Turkish Empire. Britain used their mandatory power basically to facilitate Jewish immigration, which turned out to be a big issue. You think we have problems now with the number of immigrants we're having in a much smaller country, having more immigrants was an even bigger issue. Plus, the Zionists who came as immigrants were discriminatory about labor practices, so land that Palestinians had farmed when it became owned by Jews, they wouldn't allow Palestinians to farm it or to work on it. There were a whole number of issues that began to be tension and feeling like taking that apart. Various resistances moved up. Eventually, the Palestinians went from welcoming refugees to feeling like this is really leading to our dispossession. So there were a number of struggles. And by the end of the middle of the 40s, the British had it. They said, this isn't working. We can't manage this. There were lots of guns that came in even before the Second World War from Europe, because a lot of Eastern European Jews had been parts of guerrilla movements and other things in Hungary and Eastern Europe. So they came with them not only with arms, but with training and experience. So they took this whole problem to the United Nations, brand new after the Second World War, and they said what to do with this. And of course, immigration stepped up a lot after the Second World War, and during the war. And the United Nations basically said, well, we don't know what to do, so we'll just divide it. So we'll divide it up. We'll create a Jewish state and an Arab state, and we'll leave Jerusalem as an international city. And this map over here on the right, is the map of the partition plan. So that was what the United Nations was proposing. Some have asked, why is Israel shaped like a big C like that? Well, my simple answer is that's basically flat farmland, and the center is hilly, rocky land. That's basically my answer. There are more details to that, issues about water, access to the ocean, and other things. That's the simple answer. When they divided it, the population was about 2/3, 1/3, but the land ownership was still about 93% Palestinian. The allocation on that map is 55% of the land to the Jewish state. And see, I'm not surprised, the Palestinian audiences were not in favor. But surprisingly, neither were the Zionists. The Zionists liked the idea of partitioning it to have something of their own. They didn't like that plan because that plan left too many Arabs in the area to be designated as Jewish and not enough land for the Jewish state, according to Ben Gurion. So from his writings, it's clear that he thought this was interesting to start, but not really adequate. So what happened was a series of incidents, terrorist actions, people would call it, basically the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern gangs from various groups. I would call them Jewish terrorists, Zionist terrorists, who went around and started trying to enlarge this under a plan with the British together. And eventually, the British left early. They were supposed to leave in August. They left in May. When they left, this war then really took on a pitch. And some of the neighboring countries, like Jordan and Egypt, said they would come and try to defend the population that was being held and attacked. They were not really adequate to do that. The result is the second map on the right, which is what happened where the armistice lines were drawn finally in 1948. You can see that expanded much further. Right? So a lot more land in the same basic areas was taken, and that's what became Israel in 1948-49. Those lines are what is known now as the 67, which basically means the border before the 1967 war. So it's the line from 1949 that you'll hear referred to as the 67 border. So that was the line, and then Israel petitioned to become a state member of the United Nations, and the United Nations passed a series of resolutions. The Nakba, which is the Palestinian term for that whole period of time, was when 750,000 people were moved out of their homes. According to an estimate I've discovered, about 15,000 were estimated to have been killed. Some of them assassinated in villages you've heard about, that they've seen, for which the memorial was in Minneapolis. Some of them were executed in villages by a dozen or by more. 400 plus villages were seized. Many of them were destroyed. Some still stand. This one on the right is the village of Lipton, which stands right near Jerusalem. But ruined and populated. And the vast majority of the Palestinians displaced from that became refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. This is a little side note. A friend of ours, Melly, is here tonight. Suhail's widow. Suhail just passed away a few weeks ago. And Suhail was a big supporter of the Northfielders for Justice in Palestine group. We have a Melly that Ben and I are part of. Participated in many of our events. His village in Elaport, north near Nazareth, in Galilee, was run over. All forced to leave. He was 2 at the time. His parents took him to Lebanon. But the priest in that village knew somebody who knew the Pope, or somebody close to the Pope, literally, and by virtue of intervention, they were able to return. And so they are one of very few villages that was able to return. It was a Christian village. And the village exists today, although there were a number of people there, says about aggressive, executed on the day the village was taken. Suhail wants to tell the story. He's a great colleague and friend of the 1950, right after Israel was admitted to the United Nations, and to get admitted to the United Nations, they had to be voted on twice. The first time they were denied admission because they had not agreed to follow the United Nations resolution allowing for all those 700,000 people to go back. Second time, thanks to U.S. pressure, they were admitted while agreeing to that in principle, but not being actually required to do it. So they were admitted again in 1949 in the spring, and in 1950 they passed these two laws. The first one said, anyone who has been absent for some time during the fighting started in 1947 until, quote, the state declares an end to the hostilities, was forfeited their property. So we drove you out, and because you're absent, you are now forfeiting your abandoned property. And the second one said, any Jew in the world has the right to immigrate to Israel. And in 1952, they extended that to be and granted immediate citizenship. What do you think was the date when Israel declared the end of these hostilities from 1947? Never. This law is still used to confiscate property in Jerusalem today. And then in 1967, we had the Naksa, sort of a key to the same thing. Israel basically attacked Egypt. You remember they bombed the airfields of Cairo. Jordan responded, and then bombed Jordan, and ended up taking all the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and the Sinai, and annexing all of that to Israel. In Egyptian peace deal, they eventually gave the Sinai back, but they retained all the rest. There were a number of foreign refugees. I'll show you where that was largely from in a minute. And this began what is now called occupation. Technically, in 1948, that was an occupation as well, because they occupied more land than had been granted. But that order was backed up by 67 acknowledged. But now we have a new order. This is the occupation of all these lands taken in 1967, what was remaining after 1949. 1967, the UN, the Security Council, passed another resolution, adopted unanimously, which means it included the United States support, calling for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the occupied territory, acknowledging sovereignty and territorial integrity, and calling on the UN to appoint an envoy to facilitate, quote, an acceptable solution to the conflict. Unfortunately, none of that has happened. Instead, we've had the occupation, and the occupation continues to this day. An occupation, as a term, is defined as a situation when, during international armed conflict, territory comes under the effective provisional control of a foreign power, even if it is not met with. International law imposes obligations and limitations on the actions of an occupying power, and the Charter of the UN bars acquisition of territory by war. You hear this referred to a lot in stories that have Palestinian insight about the illegality of settlements, the illegality of dislocating populations, the illegality of rules about where this is an occupied territory. It should be treated, you're a caretaker, not an owner. We'll see more about that. Jerusalem, remember, was to be an independent city. Jerusalem was fully occupied and annexed in 67 and annexed in 8. This is a report in 2022 by the UN Rapporteur on Palestine, who says about the occupation, the Israeli occupation is illegal because, one, it is proven not to be temporary. Remember, it started in 1967. We're talking in 2022. Two, it's deliberately administered against the best interests of the occupied population. And three, has resulted in the annexation of occupied territory, breaking most of the obligations imposed on the occupying power. So this is the UN's original resolution and the UN's observer conclusion about where we stand today. Settlements. Settlements, as I said, are illegal under international law. They are Jewish-only colonies, basically on land taken in the West Bank and Golan. We talked about the rule. The population right now says that as of May 2022, it was more today, but there were 12 settlements in East Jerusalem, 138 altogether in the West Bank, 150 settlement outposts, and over 674,000 number is now over 700,000.
What's a settlement outpost?
Settlement outpost is a pre-settlement, I would say. It could be a tent, it could be a trailer, it could be a truck. It's something people go and basically set up camp. It's not a permanent building. This map over here that you might have looked at before shows you the division of Israel. We'll talk more about parts of that in a minute. But you can see where all these settlements are. So settlement outposts are basically early settlements. The Oslo framework came only in 93, so this was not getting resolved. And in 93, remember, there was this big attempt to make a resolution. First, there was the Madrid peace conference that didn't go anywhere. And then there was the Oslo Accord, which happened in secret. Norway produced this Oslo framework. The framework had a couple of major points. First of all, it was the beginning of bilateral negotiations. Until that point, there really never been direct negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. Secondly, it provided for a 5-year period. So we're going to start now, and in 5 years, we're going to figure out all the rest of these details, and you'll give up the West Bank, and we'll go back to have the 67 years. And in return for that, we're going to create a Palestinian Authority, and they're going to stay only in the West Bank, give up any claims to the rest of Palestine. And the military of Israel will be redeployed from some parts of the occupied area. That was the framework. 95, what they call the Oslo Accords, where this was to try to work out the details of that. And the most important thing that happened in 95 was this map. So what they did is they said, okay, here's the map of the areas we're going to give up. And we're going to divide the areas into 3 parts. These are really important as of even today. Area A, which is the area where the Palestinian Authority will be in full control. That's what I think Palestinians imagine is going to happen for most of the West Bank. That accounts for 17% of the West Bank. We're only talking about the West Bank, which is not the whole of the Area B is going to be an area where not only Palestinian control, but Israelis will still provide security and will be very actively involved there. And that's another 23%. So together, those are 40%. And 60% of the West Bank is going to be Area C, which Israel's going to keep it now for security purposes. It was all basically originally defined as military zones. You might notice that the whole of the Jordan Valley was Area C. The largest piece of remaining farmland not taken in 1949 and 1967. I mean, people farm in the center part, but it's hilly and rocky. It's more terracing, olive orchards, a lot of stuff. The large plantations are in these other flat areas. So that was the map. And what about the 5 years? Well, the 5 years now we're in. So what came instead were settlements. Settlements in Area C. So Israel viewed Area C as an area for settlements. And the main reason for that was Rabin, who was the one who negotiated the Oslo Accords. You may remember was assassinated the same by a terrorist, Israeli Zionist in Israel. So he was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. And then Netanyahu, who had advocated and campaigned against Oslo, was elected as the next prime minister. And Netanyahu's point of view then, and remains to this day, this is a terrible idea of any land. All of this land should be Israeli. So basically, this is a comment of the Guardian by the Israeli professor who's at St. Anne's College of Oxford, commenting back on the peace agreements in 2010. So this was after 20 years. Said, well, it really failed to get the government, Sharon Kerry, the Secretary of State, failed to get the Netanyahu government to accept yet another settlement freeze as a precondition for negotiating peace talks. And he said, as long as Netanyahu remains in power, it is a safe bet that no breakthrough will achieve. He is the procrastinator par excellence, the double-faced prime minister who pretends to negotiate for addition of the pizza while continuing to dial it up. That was his comment in 2013. So 10 years later, 2013, there were 350,000 settlers in the West Bank. The gobbling up has only increased. Okay, I'm getting called to move on, which is the quick summary of this. This is a card over here that shows this. This is the history of regional development, to UN plan to 649 to today. Separation barrier. I just want to talk a bit about this map. One of the interesting statistics about the separation barrier, which I think most people think ran along the green line, that armistice line from 1949, is the barrier is actually twice the length of that. Just think a little bit about your geography. It's really not possible to draw one line on top of another and have the second line be twice as long as that line. And that's because the line doesn't really follow it. So here's the map. We're going to look at two areas. This is the area near Ramallah where we were. This red line, you can see this red line here. This is the separation barrier. This is the green line out here. So here's the green line. This area right here is where a lot of the refugees from 67 came. So that was this little, what we call a peninsula of land not taken in 1948 that remained part of the West Bank and Palestine until 1967, and that was taken. And this was basically depopulated. The wall was put up right there, and it's basically fully annexed. Jerusalem, they said the city of Jerusalem was annexed, but before the city of Jerusalem was annexed, the Israelis redefined the city of Jerusalem to include what we would call suburbs. So they basically said, we're going to annex suburbs. It'd be like if we said, St. Paul's going to annex Minneapolis. But before we do that, we're going to annex Edina and Eden Prairie and Egan. All those are going to become part of Minneapolis. And now we're going to annex Minneapolis. So that's kind of what happened here. So the Jerusalem that was annexed is much larger than the original Jerusalem. And the wall, again, goes outside of all of that down here. There's some very funny peaks in the wall, but one of the things here is this blue area is area C. So you can see these are settlements in the blue area. And this goes right up, there's Ramallah, right up against it. In fact, there's a section of this where you actually go under something on a limited access road and then under the wall again, so you can sort of pass through it, but while I'm going. All right, so that's one area. Second area is a little further north. The famous city here of Talpiya. Talpiya is basically famous because it's almost entirely surrounded by the wall. You might ask, why would they do that, given their propensity to just go inside the area? Why didn't this wall just go here? Well, because one of the things they don't want is Arab population. So the wall is defined to keep settlements and to exclude area population where possible. So this is the process of taking land and excluding population. You see these funny long gyrations here. There's this South Peak. You may have heard about this settlement here. There's already a wall around parts of that. I think there's aspiration that all of this will become wall. That's what other areas where the walls will to the extent we can. One of the things Jenny and I didn't realize is every time you're driving on a major road in the West Bank, you're basically driving on Area C, which is fully under Israeli control. There are no long distance major roads under Palestinian authority, which means the entire West Bank's access transportation is under Israeli control and supervision. When they choose to shut it down, they can shut it down, and they have. In 2018, they passed the nation-state law. Some of you probably heard of that. The nation-state law is one of what they call their basic laws. In the absence of a constitution, they've never written. They have a series of laws they call basic laws, which describe the basic tenets of the state. And this one says that the right of self-determination in Israel and the occupied territories is unique to the Jewish people. So only Jewish people have a right of self-determination. And they encourage racial segregation and discrimination against Palestinian housing, and by directing the state to promote quote, the development of Jewish settlement as a national value. So settlement is a national value. We've talked about redlining in the Twin Cities as bad history that we're trying to overcome. This is a law that in 2018 is institutionalizing redlining. The Jewish Voice for Peace group, which maybe there's some of you here tonight, there's a great chapter here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, immediately put out a press release the same day that said, today we put to bed once and for all the illusion that Israel is a democracy. The nation state bill that Israel passed today cements Israel as an apartheid state from the West Bank to Gaza to Jerusalem to Haifa. Palestinians, no matter where they live, are controlled by an Israeli government and military that robs them of their basic rights and freedom. Attributed to Rabbi Lisa Weiss, who's a great leader of Jewish Voice for Peace. So they put that out the same day. Apartheid is defined, and it's a crime defined in a series of international laws as one of two crimes against humanity, apartheid and persecution. Apartheid is defined as inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and making domination by one group over any other group of persons and systematically oppressing them. So people took this up and they began to study. And in 2020, Yesh Din, a group of Israeli volunteers for human rights, put out a legal opinion that says, in our legal opinion, the occupation in the West Bank constitutes apartheid. So what we're doing in the West Bank, in fact, is apartheid under our understanding legally and actually, factually. And this was a really big deal because they were the first organization, in this case, an Israeli organization, that said, you know, what Jewish Voice for Peace called out, what Jimmy Carter mentioned in his book, we're now saying, yep, legally, factually, we can document that. But they were focusing on the West Bank. B'Tselem, who is another Israeli human rights group, had asked the question, well, is it only the West Bank? They have been focusing mostly in the West Bank as well. They've been doing work again for a long time. And Human Rights Watch, another international group, took up the same question. Probably all started this analysis about the time Jewish Voice for Peace gave their announcement in the nation state law was passed, but these did much more in-depth, complete documentation and analysis. And both of them concluded, yep, Israel as a whole is an apartheid state. It's not just the West Bank. It's the whole thing. It's the Israel proper, the West Bank. It's an apartheid state everywhere. So B'Tselem in their report, which you have copies of over here, because it's the shortest one of these. The others of these are big. So this is the Human Rights Report. It's 200 pages. It's worth reading, but it's not a quick read. They said, while we've only focused on the West Bank in our work, B'Tselem says, we've had to come to the conclusion that it's in fact the whole thing. From the Jordan River to the sea. Human Rights Watch said the same thing. These were 2021. Then Amnesty International took this up. Amnesty International is huge. They claim, this is from their website, they claim it's a movement of 10 million people all over the world. You know about their work. They're trying to free prisoners. So they took up this question. And they came to an even broader question. Is it apartheid against Palestinians everywhere they live, not even just in Israel? Because if you're a Palestinian, you can't go back to your home. You can't visit there. If you're an Israeli, if you're a Palestinian origin, American citizen, you're treated at the border as a Palestinian, not as an American. And so they basically concluded that this is a system of apartheid against Palestinians across Israel and the occupied territories, and against Palestinians, refugees, and their descendants outside the territory. So they basically said this is apartheid against all Palestinians, wherever they are. This came out February 22, just a little over a year. So this is the evolution of this discussion of apartheid, which you hear about. And sometimes I've heard diplomats and others say the ridiculous accusation that Israel is an apartheid state. Well, it's pretty well documented. You're welcome to read all these reports. The Amnesty International report is even bigger. It's almost 300 pages, and it includes 40-some examples of incidents, specific incidents that they document as examples of apartheid. These are quotes from today, unfortunately, as well. This man now is the finance minister, also in charge of civil occupation in the West Bank. After the Palora pogrom, which happened while we were in Ramadan this spring, he said, quote, I think the Jewish war needs to be wiped out. I think the state of Israel should do it. And when people went there and acted violently, he said, oh, I didn't mean for settlers to do it. I think the army should do it. You settlers should stop being violent. Just let the army go do their work. That was his defense. In 21, he made this other curious statement. He said in a speech to the Palestinian Knesset members, quote, you are here by mistake. These are members of the Knesset because Ben Gurion did not finish the job in 48 and did not throw you out. So this is a man that Netanyahu is appointed to this government. Secretary Blinken, who just spoke at the APAC conference last week, this statement I found on the Harvard State website as of 2 days ago, he said, quote, as we support Israel's defense, to the tune of several $billions, I think $4 billion, we are also pushing back, as you've heard, on the constant effort to delegitimize Israel, which are aimed at undermining or isolating Israel's rightful place on the international stage. Quote, which is diplomatic speak for charges like female apartments. So this is the government of the United States saying, we're not only not agreeing with that, we're pushing back against it. That's me. Now, hopefully, you're still awake, and we're going to have Jenny talk about her reflections and what we do next. Thank you.
One of the things, and why we included that, is that a lot of audiences will need that background. Perhaps this one, not so much. But one of the things I learned when I was there is that everything I knew, I kind of needed to relearn, because seeing it on the ground was different than reading it on paper. One of the questions, we devised a set of questions that helped us sort of curate what we wanted to say or what we were thinking about this. And these are the questions. The first one is, why did you go? And of course, the simple answer for me is I went to be a support for Fred as he was doing his regular job-like work while we were there. And I never really thought I needed to go. I thought I could do this work without having seen it, but I was wrong. Because seeing it and being there for 10 weeks was a totally different experience than I actually expected it to be. Our being there, and I have to say that I'm grateful beyond words for the friendships we developed with Paul and Ann. We were comrades to each other. They were guides to us. They were, they became dear friends. Is there anything else? How would you describe the physical landscape? I absolutely fell in love with the place and the people that are Palestine. The center picture of the flag and the crane was, it was not right outside our window, but it was outside the window. And every morning I looked up at that and I was inspired by that. The rest of these pictures represent an UNRWA kindergarten in Deir Kaddish. Huh? Oh, and yeah, an UNRWA kindergarten in Deir Kaddish, mint tea, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and this is actually on Orthodox Palm Sunday. It's another board member, Paul and Fred. I fell in love with the rich tapestry that is Palestine. This was a little girl after Friday prayers. And I was walking down the street and she reminded me so much of my granddaughter that I had to take her picture. And her mother was so thrilled that she unzipped her coat and said, "Take it now." That is me with the mother of a Carleton student that just treated us with exorbitant hospitality. Being in the presence of the Dome on the Rock, the Ramallah Friends School, and just even the barren hillside with the olive trees. I absolutely fell in love with it.
Jenny,
What?
what's that photograph on the right?
It's the Ramallah Friends School. It's the entrance to the school. Yeah. And I will say that for the next set of questions, any one of the answers. Oh, the other thing I would be remiss if I did not honor as part of what we learned while we were there and what is happening there. And this is by no means complete. ANERA is the American Near East Refugee Association. Fred is on their board. They provided an umbrella for some of the things that we did. And they provided people that became friends. ICAD is the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. We went on one of their tours. Their founder, Jeff Halper, is actually from Hibbing, Minnesota. He's also a MAC graduate. Beit Salem is an Israeli Information Center for Human Rights. They are there at everything that happens. They document almost every infraction. Their executive director became my hero. He was front and center of everything, as was Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former Israeli military that now do extraordinary tours, mostly into Hebron right now. But El Haq, which is the Lorley group that is lifting up the occupation to the world scene, to the international scene, and Defense for Children International. We visited them at their office and talked to the director. And I asked him a question, something like, how do you find success? He said, the only way we can define success is that the work we're doing might prevent more child detentions. Is that by being on the ground, that might. How would you describe the mental landscape? And I would say for me, it was as occupied as the physical landscape. I got my news from Twitter, which might seem odd, but it really works for alternative news sources. It works very well for alternative news sources. I found that when I was on the ground, I had to relearn almost everything I thought I knew. Because when I saw it, I had to start to tease out the many threads. The occupation is not complicated, but it's full of many, many, many different threads. My mental landscape was also informed by paradoxes and contradictions. I looked at the flag out my window and I thought of resistance, and I thought of good resistance. And then I thought about resistance in the United States, and what does that look like and feel like? And how do I hold these two groups wanting resistance or opposing what they think is unfair and unjust? What else? Another one of the paradoxes was about safety. I felt so safe walking in Ramallah, but yet there were cautionary tales about getting on a taxi too late in the day and going from Ramallah to somewhere else because you didn't know, because the settlers came out mostly in the afternoon, so that's no longer the case. There was a paradox of the fact that I was a pseudo-resident, but I wasn't really a resident and I wasn't really a tourist. I didn't have the umbrella of a tour group that made it easy for me to get on a bus to go from place to place. I had to figure out how to orchestrate that. And so I didn't see as much as I might have wanted to see, but what I did see, I saw and I felt with much more intensity. And for each of these next answers, some of the questions are what is beautiful and what is meaningful, and what is beautiful is also what is meaningful, and what is meaningful is also what is beautiful, and what is impactful is also meaningful. So the answers intersect. But the bottom line is that within each of those, there is some ugliness. If it's beautiful, there's also ugliness as part of it that makes it beautiful. And in answering these questions, there are many of these threads that we did not attempt to include. One is home demolitions, or the pogroms in Hawara, and settler violence, which is out the kazoo, or settlements, or administrative detention, or collective punishment, or US complicity. Those are all threads, and each of those threads could be a whole presentation in themselves. So this is about one of the paradoxes. We went to Tulkarm to visit the parents of a student that we had met here, who was at McAllister when we met her. In Ramallah, we lived close to the central city. We were next to the bus stations and the taxi stations, and it was loud. You'd walk out of campus, campus was like here, it was a refuge. But we would walk out and it's loud. It's very loud. We went to their house in Tulkarm and it was like this refuge. It was lemon trees and orange trees and olive trees and quiet. And it was beautiful. And we ate ice cream in the city of Tulkarm. But Osama works in construction in Israel. So every morning he goes to the checkpoint, which is the top center picture, and goes through the checkpoint and parks his car, walks through the checkpoint and goes to Israel and comes back at the end of the day. And I asked him what it was like to go through the checkpoint now. And he said, it's not too bad right now. And after I got home, just last week, I saw a headline that says Israel is to bring in 10,000 Indian laborers to replace Palestinians. And I wonder if Osama will be one of those. And what will he do if he doesn't have that? What impacted you the most? What was most impactful and stunning to me is that even I could be in the West Bank and at times not realize that it was occupied. On our first trip to, our only trip to Bethlehem, we went through Kalandia, which is a famous checkpoint, but we were in an Israeli taxi, so we kind of breezed through as if it was no different than going through a toll booth. And you can go to Bethlehem and see Manger Square and do all of the other major biblical tourist things there. And you could go and never see the Bethlehem Wall. You could go and not even really know that it was there. The next picture over is taken out the window of a car. And one of the things I knew there were settlements, but I didn't know what they looked like from the car or from the ground. And so I was continually asking if it was somebody I knew in the car, is that a settlement or is that a Palestinian village? I didn't know how to recognize it. And so that was a learning for me, that I could be there. And if I didn't know to ask that question, I wouldn't know that it really wasn't supposed to be there. And the same with the road. You can drive down the road and see a sort of guard station. And it wasn't until Fred and I got back and we looked at the map and we realized that most of the roads that we had ridden on were in Area C. They were Israeli roads. Palestinians can't build roads in Area C. They can't build houses. They don't have access to water. They don't have access to electric grids. They're completely on their own in Area C. But all the roads that we rode on were probably Area C roads. So it was just stunning to me that even I could be there. And if I hadn't known to ask these questions, what was the most beautiful thing you experienced? And I said Gaza. This is going into and out of Gaza. There are 3 checkpoints. there's an Israeli checkpoint, there's a Palestinian Authority checkpoint, and there's a Hamas checkpoint. We went into Gaza under the auspices of ANERA, the American Near East Refugee Association, which provides basic needs to the Palestinians in the form of food and medical care and kindergarten education. This one down here in the lower left-hand corner is an organization that lifts up abused women that they partly fund. And these women are making Ramadan treats. That's Fred at breakfast, donkey carts for when there's no gas. Fishing boats, we all know that the fishing boats only have a certain, their international limit is not the standard international limit, it's much less. And the picture on the top right, when we were in Bethlehem, there was a exhibit at the Waldorf Hotel by Palestinian artists, and we bought one of the paintings. And that is us with the artist that we were able to meet in Gaza. And this artist, he invited in his cousin to translate. His cousin had been in Canada and knew English better than he did. But what is most amazing about Subi is he is not only a good artist, but he's a fantastic teacher. He has a studio where he teaches students 2 or 3 afternoons a week. The same students come in and they do absolutely incredible artwork. We also work with a group called the Leonard Educational Organization, which works to support Palestinians in higher education. Leo does not do scholarships, but they do a lot of emotional support and incidental expenses for students. They started out just in the United States, but discovered there was such a need in Gaza and the West Bank that they've sort of expanded who they help. I lost my train of thought. And they have a number of students in Gaza that they have helped. And we had an iftar dinner with some of the students that were there. One student reached out to Leo or found out about Leo. He had completed all of his classwork for dentistry school, but he couldn't get a certificate because he was $400 short. So Leo stepped up and gave him the $400. Another student wanted to go to medical school in Cairo, and she didn't have the resources. So Leo found a funder for her, and she was there that night in the process of studying for her boards. Another student who was there that night, during the last round of bombing in Gaza, was beside herself because they had bombed a cemetery. And she was afraid it was the cemetery where her parents and some of her siblings were buried. They had been killed in 2014 bombings while she was studying in the United States. So to have a dinner with them, it was just an extraordinary experience. And it really is true that these youth live in exploitative environments, but they have incredible resilience to fight against that. And one of the things that Leo does is help to give them a backbone. I'm going to skip these. One of the things that was most meaningful, I need some notes for this one. Let me go back to. I just want to point out that the bottom right says cut in food aid deepens the crisis in Gaza. The UN World Food Program is out of money. And food assistance to over 200,000 people in Gaza and the West Bank will totally end by August. And we're talking assistance at the level of $30 or $50 a month. And this is the story of Shadi Curry. Shadi Curry last year was a junior at the Ramallah's Friends School. In October, 12 Israeli military and police officers raided his house to arrest him at 4 o'clock in the morning. He was taken to Moscovia Interrogation Center, which is known to be one of the most severe interrogation centers in Israel. And this is from an article by Gideon Levy, who is a opinion writer for Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper. This is what I got. They would call him Christian to insult him. They would repeatedly beat and humiliate him in jail in the course of his abduction. At the break of dawn from his East Jerusalem home, the black-clad police officers beat him until he bled. They broke his nose and a tooth. After he refused to undress their presence, then they dragged him by force, bound and blindfolded to their van. This is after they take him to the detention facility. Room number 4 is on the top floor of the building. After tripping on the first step, Shadi, blindfolded and with his hands bound behind his back, was dragged up there by his jailers. He had no idea now whether his interrogators were from the Shin Bet or the police. They didn't introduce themselves. He was eventually he was arrested on the suspicion of involvement in disturbances and causing harm to Israelis. Charges were pressed under a terrorism clause. And he was held in detention for 6 weeks. He was released to house arrest on November 27th, where he could not leave his house. I think it was in March. He was allowed back to school. He was given permission to come back to school under the care of guardians. And on May 21st, he had another trial that was in the middle of finals week. During this trial, a prosecution witness, there were 9 other 14 to 16-year-olds arrested along with him. And one of the prosecution witness recanted his confession and said he had been forced to implicate Shadi under fear of reprisal from the Israeli military. So in exchange for his own freedom, he had implicated Shadi, but he recanted this. The resolution of this next court appearance is October 23rd. And until then, he remains under house arrest. Shadi is from a wealthy East Jerusalem family, but he is not an exception. He is the rule more, and just to point along with that and briefly, Betty McCollum has introduced into Congress the Defending Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Occupation. And it prohibits US tax dollars, and most of us probably know that we give a minimum of $3.8 billion a year to Israel, from being used on the military detention of Palestinian children. Palestinian children are tried in military courts and not in civil courts. And there are 500 to 700 of these cases every year. To prevent US tax dollars from being used to support the seizure and destruction of Palestinian property. Right now, there are 58 schools that are scheduled for demolition by the Israeli courts. Or to prohibit tax dollars from support or assistance of Israelis' unilateral annexation of Palestinian territory. Would I go back? I'd go back in a heartbeat. I would go back in a heartbeat. But I feel that there's a lot of work that needs to be done here on the ground to help bring down the occupation and to dismantle the apartheid state. And this is where the work needs to be done. It is up to us to witness this injustice and speak against it, which I'm sure that most of the people in this room already do. Besides endorsing the WAMM Sister City petition, I would ask that the AFC tonight is launching an apartheid-free communities campaign. And it is one way, I think, where they seek to build this movement. They're asking community organizations, churches, any possible group to join this and make it part of a larger witnessing to what is going on. And within this initiative, there are invitations to educate both yourself and others and to advocate for legislative change, such as Betty McCollum's bill. This initiative is coming out of the American Friends Service Committee, and Dov Baum has said it is time for progressives in the US to stop their misguided and you guys don't need that. But it's time for us to expand this however we can do it. And I know we're all working hard to do that. And this is the apartheid-free pledge. So, yeah. And I honestly think that we need to normalize the word apartheid with respect to Israel in US discord. I think that that's a really important thing. And how would an apartheid-free world be different? You want to speak about the painting? No, you speak about it more eloquently than I do.
So as we end, this is the painting that captured us in Bethlehem. So we painted this painting in 2016. And Jenny and I both found ourselves just staring at it. It sort of comes to represent, if you're Palestinian, close your eyes and feel the life you know, the life you'd like to live. You can feel, he called this painting harmony. You can feel harmony. Holding that oud is a familiar thing. That's a familiar place. That all feels great, except the factual reality is it's painful and it doesn't work. And that's the occupation. You're surrounded by familiarity. If you close your eyes, you can remember what life was like, but you can't actually make it work. We just found it very powerful. And I asked him about it, why it was 2016. He hadn't sold it until 2023. And I felt bad. I felt bad because he said to me, I had a lot of offers for that painting, but it was my favorite painting and I actually had it in my home. When the Bethlehem Museum Gallery asked for one painting from a number of artists, that was my one painting I sent to Bethlehem to represent us in Gaza. And then we bought it, I think at a generous price. I hope you got paid generously for it. But it made me feel we really need to steward this and to tell its story because it's, to me, it's an important illustration of the whole story we're trying to share. I hope you liked it. That's us. Thank you for listening and we'll take questions.